Hello, Internet! Welcome to Wednesday's Serial Thing. This is more of a comment response because I got into a thing online about how Spider-Man's legacy has been upheld by a number of different characters and whatnot, but Scott from NerdSync is arguing that really the only one doing so is Miles Morales, solely because he's the only one to carry, like, on the book title Spider-Man and not something a little different. And I kind of want to prove why that's kind of a problematic way to look at things. So this is going to be a bunch of thoughts around that because there's a bunch of different angles I think you have to consider if you're going to be looking at it like that. So Spider-Man's been around for over 50 years. And he's been a main character, like the header of Marvel in many cases through different periods in time, up and down. But the idea that he wouldn't have a spin-off or any other characters to push his legacy in any way is problematic to me, and to think that it only would have happened in the last few is odd. So there's that to begin with. So there's a bunch of characters that have held up the mantle in some way or another throughout the years. So one of the obvious ones to me is that, Peter Parker was supposed to be replaced at one point, and he was supposed to be replaced by Ben Reilly. But Ben Reilly's a clone, and how you want to view that, that's kind of a weird idea when you're talking about legacy, too. But, Peter Parker is certainly not the only one to have been in the suit, and definitely is supposed to be replaced, but Ben Reilly's kind of a weird misnomer either way. But there are other people who have worn the suit and just been Spider-Man. There's also Mac Gargan, who's been it. There's also Apak, if I'm saying that right. There's also, and here's an interesting one who's pushed the character in a lot of ways and took the legacy in a different way. Otto Octavius was in the suit as well. And that spins the whole thing in a different way. Also, Hobie Brown. So, there's a number of characters who've done it, and Miles is definitely more notable than most of those. And to the point of legacy, I think infinitely more important than most of those. But he's hardly the first or the last, and a lot of those other characters had the title Spider-Man on their book. And that's odd to me. Atop that, if you're just arguing book titles, Peter Parker has barely ever just been Spider-Man. It's amazing, sensational, spectacular, some adjective. It's some Spider-Man something else. And then so to say that Miguel O'Hara is Spider-Man 2099, but Spider-Man 2099 is different than the Amazing Spider-Man is one thing. Also, right now they have to differentiate it, and it's the Amazing Spider-Man versus Spider-Man. So is that to say that one can't be amazing? It's such an odd and weird and corporate way to look at things. It's avoiding kind of the heart of the stories and the heart of the characters and what they're doing. So, I think a lot of this, as you said to me, is about semantics. So if we're going to be talking semantics, bringing up definitions only makes sense. Let's look at the definition of legacy. So I think the biggest one we're looking at, because we're not really looking at property by will and whatnot, obviously, a lot of the other ones are just other definitions. I think the one we're focusing on is the second one, which is anything handed down from the past as from an ancestor or predecessor. So, of course, we're looking at predecessor for the most part, with an obvious exception here. But that's the thing, is Spider-Man is the predecessor to a lot of other Spider-Men, Spider-Women. It's not supposed to be so title inclusive, and I think the idea of it being so inclusive to the title only is we're borrowing from the idea of the familial. So we're looking at surnames primarily with that, right? And that's how you get the legacy from your family, and that's how it's passed down generally. Which in and of itself has, a societal argument going on right now with, should women have to, carry the last name of the husband? Do you hybrid the names with the child? How does that work? Um, that's a whole thing we're looking and discussing right now in general. But I mean, you can't avoid the fact that that is a sort of, lack of a better word, patriarchal idea. I mean, for good or ill. I'm not trying to argue that. I'm just trying to argue that is the idea, that is where it's coming from. And, you know, it has its roots there. So by you saying that it can only be someone who is named Spider-Man and only Spider-Man, nothing but Spider-Man, you're avoiding the fact that, you know, he was never Spider-Man. He was the Amazing Spider-Man, your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, Spidey. You know, this tie to such a specific name and title doesn't hold as well for Spider-Man because that's just not the character. When you're talking about someone like Captain America or Cap, the whole idea of his title and whatnot being passed forward is easier to do because it's gender neutral, but it is also a title, and so transferring it like that across other people is easier. And so I feel like we're avoiding the debate of what we're actually disagreeing on here. And here we see something that is them taking from the past and looking at Spider-Man to bring it to the future for 2099. He is the predecessor, and this is the future. I want to look at another frame from when Miguel's put to the past, Spider-Man's put to the future. They have this whole, you know, lovely time crossover issue. But there's one moment in particular that really speaks to the idea of legacy. I mean, look at this. Miguel is saying a century from now, Spider-Man is revered as a hero, while you, and J. Jonah is guessing what, and Spider-Man says you're nothing, you're lost to history. Look at that. He's wearing a Spider-Man uniform, and earlier in the comic, you know, Peter Parker Spider-Man's in the future, and he gets confused for Miguel because he's wearing a Spider-Man uniform, and people just figure it's a Spider-Man. That whole idea, this is literally playing off the idea that Miguel got weirdo different spider powers, but they're spider powers, and for that he taps into the legacy of the past. That is literally what he's saying here. This is why he took the costume, this is why he took the idea, because he wanted to be a hero, and Spider-Man is revered as a hero. That is legacy. Then let's look at the next person really in question. Again, the familial. Mayday, of course. I mean, that's the thing. As Mayday Parker, she is just, you know, Peter Parker's daughter. That's it. But when she decides to adopt the mantle of Spider-Girl, she's adopting the legacy of Spider-Man. That's important, and that's literally exactly what we're arguing about here. Now, the argument that was put to me is she isn't caring for the legacy of Spider-Man because she's not Spider-Man. But you're literally saying by that she cannot carry forward Spider-Man's legacy in that way because she is a girl. She's Spider-Girl, or eventually, you know, Spider-Woman, not Spider-Man. That's saying that she, as a woman, can't carry forward her father's legacy because of her gender. That's insane. That's saying daughters cannot carry forward their father's legacy. That's silly. And that doesn't even work because, again, you're taking this idea of names to a point where it doesn't even work, because the idea of names with legacy is only ever supposed to be the surname. And because we're dealing with titles here, that doesn't work. And I see where you're coming from on that. That the title Spider-Man isn't being carried forward with it, and you're saying that. But when you say title, you're taking it to this extreme. So someone like Spider-Man 2099 can't be holding it because he's Spider-Man 2099, even though he's never referred to that way, except very briefly once when they meet up, because they're distinguishing amongst themselves and not just calling everyone Spider-Man, which is something they also plan later when you're looking at Spider-Verse, and they have a bazillion Spider-Men from all kinds of different walks of life, universes, ideas, whatever, every iteration of Spider-Man they're putting together, and they start calling themselves something different because they that's how names are supposed to work, is to differentiate people, so when you cry a name in a crowded room, people can figure out who the heck you're trying to talk to. You're saying because of that they're not carrying forward the legacy. That you're like conflating all these different things and avoiding the point of what legacy is supposed to be about. So, I mean, looking at that last bit, that is when Mayday is discovering about the legacy of Spider-Man held in her family. Held in her family, generations going forward, and how that conflates with someone else's family. That's legacy. That is legacy, is your family's history carrying forward and what you're doing with it. I mean, this is how legacy has worked in fiction since the idea of Arthurian legend. Like, it's just that is what the idea of legacy, especially for a hero, is about, more tightly held than anything. And this is not to discount anything. And as you point out, Miles does a great job of carrying the legacy forward in a different way. And I'm not trying to discount that he's a great character that is upholding the legacy in a different way than these other two. I'm just saying, to say that he does so in a way that lessens the others is a tough pill to swallow, and hard, because you're discounting other great characters and other great characters that did it first. And maybe you think by me saying that having Miles do this is discrediting the others is too harsh a point, but it's all in your presentation. You don't mention them, and the fact that your title is How Miles Morales Turned Marvel's Spider-Man into a Legacy implies no one else has. And by implying no one else has, it is discounting and lessening what these other characters have done before and what those creators put in and what they were doing with it. That's just inherent in how this has been put forward. Also, even in your video, you kind of hit on the 2 points I'm talking about. Like, Spider-Man 2099 is really just Spider-Man. But you point out Batman to the Robin legacies, like him raising all that up and then bringing people into the fold. That's Robin and Batman. Like, those are completely different titles. And one is, subservient to the other. Then you talk about the Phantom and like how there's that legacy in pushing forward. And so, I mean, I get that they all carry the Phantom name, but I mean, Spider-Girl is the daughter of Spider-Man going forward. Like, that is just that. It really is just that simple. But again, I mean, I feel the main problem is that you're conflating all these ideas and you're really taking metatextual more importantly than textual. You're taking the idea that the title of the comic that he is currently in and only has been for about a year is Spider-Man. Before that, it was Ultimate Comics Spider-Man or Ultimate Spider-Man or Ultimate Comics Miles Morales Spider-Man or Miles Morales Spider-Man. It was only very briefly just been Spider-Man. And besides that, that is just the title to the comic. That is not upheld in any way really in the text. He is called Spider-Man. So are many other characters. And with the recent Spider-Verse thing, many, many other characters are. But whether or not they're real or count is based on whether or not they're from a certain universe or not. That seems problematic, especially when you're talking about comic books, and especially Marvel or DC comic books, because the whole idea of alternate universes and how those go in and out of each other is always flexible. I mean, much more so in DC than Marvel, but that idea has just kind of meshed together for so long because, I mean, Ultimate Comics is hardly the first alternate universe that's been pulled into the main fold. And having these characters from all these different universes and have them intermix is standard, everyday affair in this sort of story. So it's such a bizarre angle to take that you're honing in on this. It's such a small thing too. It's just there are other characters that made Spider-Man a legacy character before Miles. Miles is the greatest one and has the greatest potential right now to be seen in other media. Definitely. Totally. No question. I think the heart of your argument still stands. I just think that there's a really fine point that betrays the legacy, that negates so many other characters and so much diversity of the Marvel Universe, that really narrows down the view, that I think is problematic because you're avoiding the history. And you're also kind of avoiding the history and celebration of what Miles Morales was coming out of the Ultimate Universe, because part of the reason the Ultimate Universe is so celebrated is because it's hardly the first time Marvel's pulled a stunt like that. Most noticeably, the other two times they've done something similar were Marvel 2099 and the MC2 universe. Very similar ideas, but they push for a future thing to go with future ideas as opposed to doing a parallel universe. And it turns out that parallel universe ideas what really stuck, and they made it work. And that's part of the reason why that's such a great thing, the fact that they could play around with characters in the way they did. But I mean, even then, the Ultimate Universe isn't the first time they've done that, because there's, like Mutant X or other comics that have gone along those lines. Exiles, although the timing on that, not 100%, I have to look that up. But that's the problem. You're talking about legacy, and you're avoiding the history that came before. That's really the long and short of it there. It took me forever to get there. That's why I can't make successful videos like you. So, meh. There you go. And for everybody else, thanks for watching, and I'm sure I'll talk about another comic book soon. Maybe not Spider-Man or Ninja Turtles. Wouldn't that be a change?